Arizona Territory, 1871. The smoke still rose from the scattered wagons when she found them. A man clutching his bleeding shoulder, 5 terrified children huddled behind an overturned chest, and 23 bodies cooling under the desert sun. The Apache woman had heard the gunshots echoing through Devil's Canyon at dawn, but by the time she reached the massacre site, only silence remained. What she discovered would change 6 lives forever, though she had every reason to let them die. Aiyana moved like a shadow through the twisted mesquite and palo verde, her moccasined feet making no sound on the rocky ground. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the copper scent of blood filled her nostrils as she approached the remains of what had been a wagon train, bound for California. 12 wagons had set out from Tucson 3 days ago, carrying families seeking new lives in the promised lands beyond the mountains. Now they lay scattered like broken toys across the canyon floor. She crouched behind a boulder, dark eyes scanning the carnage. Her people had not done this. The tracks told a different story. Shod horses, not the unshod ponies of the Apache. These were white men's boots in the dust, white men's bullets in the dead. Bandits most likely preying on families brave enough, or foolish enough to cross Apache territory with minimal escort. A soft whimper caught her attention. Behind an overturned wagon, she spotted movement. Aiyana waited, patient as the hawk circling overhead. Another sound. A man's voice, low and reassuring. She counted the bodies visible from her position. Men, women, children, all sprawled in, the grotesque positions of sudden death. But somewhere in that wreckage, life persisted. She could leave now. Should leave now. Her own people would call her foolish for what she was considering. The white settlers had brought nothing but trouble to the Apache. Their soldiers hunted her kind like animals. Their diseases had killed her younger brother. Their promises meant nothing, their treaties less than dust. But the crying continued, a child's sob that cut through her resolve like a knife through deerskin. Thomas Brennan pressed his hand against the bullet wound in his shoulder, trying to stanch the bleeding while keeping his remaining children calm. The attack had come at first light, just as they were breaking camp. Riders with bandanas covering their faces had thundered down from the rimrock, guns blazing. In the space of 10 minutes, his world had been destroyed. His wife Martha lay 20 yards away, struck down while trying to reach their youngest. He'd forced himself to look away from her still form, focusing instead on the 5 small faces depending on him for survival. 12-year-old Rebecca held baby Samuel, her tear-streaked face trying to be brave. The twins, Johnny and Jamie, just 8 years old, clung to each other behind a water barrel. 10-year-old Grace pressed herself against his good side, trembling. "Pa, what do we do now?" Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas looked at his shoulder wound. The bleeding had slowed, but he felt weak. No horses remained alive. The bandits had shot them or driven them off. Water was scarce, food scattered. The nearest town lay 3 days' walk across hostile desert, and that was for a healthy man traveling alone. "We'll figure something out." "Becky," he said, though he had no idea what. That's when he saw her. The Apache woman emerged from behind the rocks like something from a dream or nightmare. She wore traditional dress, deerskin skirt and blouse decorated with beadwork, her long, black hair braided with feathers and silver. A knife hung at her hip, and she carried a rifle with easy familiarity. Thomas instinctively pushed his children further behind the wagon. Aiyana stopped 30 feet away, studying the family. The man was wounded, but not dying. The children were frightened, but unharmed. She could see the calculation in his eyes, whether to fight or surrender. With his injured arm and 5 young ones to protect, he had few options. "You are hurt," she said in careful English, her voice carrying the musical accent of her people. Thomas blinked in surprise. He'd expected war whoops and violence, not conversation. We're not looking for trouble," he managed. A bitter smile touched her lips. "Trouble has already found you, white man." She stepped closer, ignoring how he tensed. Up close, she could see the wound was clean. The bullet had passed through without hitting bone. He would live if infection didn't set in. The children watched her with wide eyes, fear and curiosity warring in their young faces. "You cannot stay here," she said, glancing around the massacre site. "The smell of death draws predators, two-legged and four-legged both." Thomas struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. "We're grateful for your concern, but we can't go anywhere. My children will die in the desert," Aiyana finished bluntly. "As will you, with that wound and no horse. No water." Rebecca spoke up, her voice small but determined. "Are you going to kill us?" Aiyana looked at the girl, hair the color of corn silk, eyes like winter sky. She reminded her of someone, though the memory was too painful to pursue. "If I wanted you dead, child, you would be dead." "Then what do you want?" Thomas asked. That was the question, wasn't it? What did she want? Revenge for her people's suffering, justice for the wrongs done to the Apache, or perhaps something simpler, to prove that mercy still existed in a world growing darker each year. "My camp is half a day's walk," she said finally. "You can rest there, tend your wound. When you are stronger, I will guide you to the soldiers' fort." Thomas stared at her in disbelief. "Why would you help us?" Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, watching a vulture circle overhead. "My name is Aiyana," she said at last. "It means eternal blossom. My mother chose it because she hoped I would always find reasons to bloom, even in harsh seasons." She turned her dark gaze back to him. "What is your name, wounded man?" "Thomas Brennan. These are my children. Rebecca, Grace, Johnny, Jamie, and baby Samuel." Aiyana nodded to each child in turn, filing away their names. "We will gather what supplies remain, then leave this place of death. The little ones should not see more than they already have." As if to emphasize her point, a coyote howled in the distance, answered by another. They moved slowly across the desert landscape, Thomas leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch while Aiyana scouted ahead. She had salvaged what she could from the wagon train: a few water barrels, some dried goods, blankets, and ammunition. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The children walked in a tight group, Rebecca carrying Samuel when he grew fussy. The twins stayed close to their father, while Grace seemed fascinated by their Apache guide despite her fear. Every so often the girl would ask whispered questions. "Is she really going to help us, Pa?" Johnny asked during one of their brief rests. Thomas watched Aiyana as she knelt by a distant boulder, studying tracks only she could read. "I think so, son. I hope so." "Ma always said Indians were savages," Grace whispered. "Your ma was afraid," Thomas replied carefully. "Sometimes fear makes us say things that aren't true," Aiyana returned, her expression grim. "We have company," she announced. 3 riders, following our trail." Thomas felt his blood chill. "The bandits? Perhaps. Or perhaps men who heard about the massacre and come to find what they can steal from the dead." She checked her rifle. "Either way, they mean no good." "What do we do?" Aiyana looked at the exhausted children, then at the rocky terrain ahead. "There is a hidden canyon not far from here. We can lose them there, but we must move quickly." The next 2 hours tested everyone's endurance. Thomas bit back groans of pain as his wound reopened. The children stumbled over rocks and through thorny scrub, their clothes torn and faces scratched. But Aiyana led them true, finding paths where none seemed to exist, reading the land like pages in a book. Finally, she led them through what appeared to be a solid rock wall, an optical illusion, created by the way 2 canyon walls overlapped. Inside lay a hidden valley no bigger than a small farm, with a spring bubbling up from limestone rocks and enough grass to support a few deer. "We rest here tonight," Aiyana declared. "Tomorrow, we reach my people." Chapter 5. Stories by firelight. That evening, as Thomas slept fitfully and the younger children dozed around a small, carefully concealed fire, Rebecca found herself sitting across from Aiyana. The Apache woman was working on something, weaving grass into what looked like a small basket. "You don't have to help us," Rebecca said quietly. Aiyana's hands never paused in their work. "No, I do not." "Then why?" The woman was silent for so long that Rebecca thought she wouldn't answer. Then Aiyana began to speak, her voice soft in the firelight. 7 summers ago I had a daughter. She was your age, perhaps a little younger. Hair like a raven's wing, eyes like mine. She could track a butterfly across stone and make music from a reed pipe. Rebecca leaned forward, sensing the importance of what she was hearing. Soldiers came to our camp one winter morning. They said, we had stolen cattle, killed settlers. This was not true, but truth did not matter to them. In the fighting that followed, my daughter... Aiyana's voice caught. A soldier's bullet found her as she tried to reach me. I'm sorry, Rebecca whispered. The soldier who killed her was, perhaps your father's age. He had kind eyes. I remember that clearly. After the battle, I found him dying of his wounds. I could have let him die, should have let him die. Instead, I gave him water, bound his injuries. He lived. Aiyana held up the finished basket, examining her work. Later, I learned he had 4 children of his own, a wife who waited for him to return home. By saving his life, I saved theirs as well. Do you regret it? The Apache woman met her eyes, every day and never. Rebecca pondered this contradiction. I don't understand. You will, child. When you are older and the world has tested your heart, you will. Aiyana set the basket aside and reached for another bundle of grass. Tell me about your mother. So Rebecca did, sharing memories of Martha Brennan's gentle hands and warm laugh, her way of making even their poor meals taste like feasts. As she spoke, she began to understand something about the woman across from her, that helping them wasn't just an act of mercy, but a way of honoring her own daughter's memory. The next morning brought new challenges. Thomas's fever had broken during the night, but he remained weak. Baby Samuel had developed a cough that worried everyone, and when Aiyana scouted their back trail, she found signs that their pursuers were still following. We must reach my people. Today, she announced. Can you travel? Thomas nodded grimly, though Rebecca could see the effort it cost him. They broke camp quickly, leaving no trace of their presence except disturbed grass around the spring. The journey to the Apache camp took them through increasingly rugged country. Aiyana moved with practiced ease, but the family struggled to keep up. She found herself constantly looking back, measuring their progress against the danger behind them. Finally, late in the afternoon, they crested a ridge and looked down into a hidden valley where smoke rose from several wickiups, traditional Apache dwellings made of brush and hides. Children played near a stream while women worked at various tasks. Men sat in council near the largest structure. Stay close to me, Aiyana warned. Do not speak unless spoken to. Keep your hands visible at all times. They descended into the camp like figures from a fever dream. The wounded white man, his 5 children, and the Apache woman who had chosen to save them. Conversations stopped. Children stared. Warriors reached for weapons. An older man with silver streaking his black hair rose from the council circle. When he spoke, it was in rapid Apache, his tone sharp with questions. Aiyana responded in the same language, her voice calm, but firm. The exchange continued for several minutes, while the Brennan family stood in awkward silence. Finally, the older man switched to English. I am Cochise, war leader of these people. Aiyana tells me you are survivors of an attack by white bandits. Thomas found his voice. Yes, sir. They killed everyone else. My wife. He stopped, unable to continue. Cochise studied them with eyes that seemed to see everything. And now you seek refuge among those you would call your enemies. I don't consider you my enemy, Thomas said carefully. You're Aiyana's people. She saved our lives. Aiyana has a generous heart, Cochise replied, though his tone suggested this wasn't entirely a compliment. Sometimes too generous. He spoke again in Apache to a woman standing nearby, clearly giving orders. She nodded and approached the family, gesturing for them to follow. You will be given food and shelter, Cochise told Thomas. When you are strong enough to travel, we will discuss what comes next. The next weeks passed like a strange dream. The Brennan family found themselves living in a world completely alien to everything they'd known, yet surprisingly welcoming once the initial suspicion faded. Thomas's wound healed cleanly under the care of the Apache medicine woman, an ancient, figure called Grandmother Spider who seemed to know remedies for ailments he'd never heard of. Samuel's cough disappeared after a few doses of tea made from desert plants. The older children adapted with the resilience of youth, learning new games from Apache youngsters and picking up scattered words of the complex language. Rebecca proved especially adept, her natural intelligence and Aiyana's patient teaching, combining to give her a basic grasp of Apache customs and speech. She learned to help with traditional women's work, gathering plants, preparing food, weaving baskets. In return, she taught some of the Apache children simple English words and showed them games from her own culture. The twins, Johnny and Jamie, became fascinated with Apache hunting techniques. Under the watchful eyes of young warriors not much older than themselves, they learned to track animals, to move silently through brush, to read the stories written in broken twigs and displaced stones. Grace, always the most sensitive of the children, spent her time with the elders, listening to stories told in the evening firelight. Though she understood perhaps one word in 10, she seemed to grasp the deeper meanings, tales of courage and loss, of the connection between all living things, of the responsibility each person bore to their community. Thomas himself struggled, more with the adjustment. His practical skills, carpentry, farming, basic blacksmithing, had little application in Apache society. He felt useless, dependent on people who had every reason to despise him. But gradually, he found ways to contribute. His knowledge of white men's ways proved valuable when planning raids on army supply trains. His careful nature and attention to detail made him useful in maintaining weapons and equipment. More importantly, he began to understand the complex web of relationships that held Apache society together, the unwritten laws that governed behavior, the deep spirituality that saw the sacred in every aspect of daily life. As autumn approached, subtle changes occurred in the camp's attitude toward the Brennan family. What had begun as grudging tolerance evolved into something approaching acceptance. Thomas found himself included in discussions of camp security and supply gathering. The children were no longer strangers, but simply part of the community's extended family. Aiyana watched these changes with mixed feelings. She had grown attached to the family she'd saved, particularly to Rebecca, who reminded her so painfully of her lost daughter. But she also knew this situation couldn't last forever. Sooner or later, decisions would have to be made. That decision point came on a crisp October morning when scouts reported the approach of a cavalry patrol. 20 soldiers, led by a lieutenant who bore a white flag, were requesting parley with Cochise. The war leader called a council. Thomas was surprised to find himself invited to participate, a sign of how far he'd come in Apache estimation. "They come to negotiate for your return," Cochise announced without preamble. "Word has reached the soldiers' fort that you survived the massacre. They offer trade goods, horses, safe passage to California in exchange for your family." Thomas looked around the circle of faces, some friendly, some neutral, a few still openly hostile. "What do you think I should do?" "That is not for us to decide," Cochise replied. "You are not our prisoner. You are free to choose your path." But Thomas could see the unspoken question in many eyes. Would he return to his own people and perhaps bring trouble back to those who had sheltered him? Would he honor the trust placed in him, or would gratitude prove weaker than racial loyalty? That evening, he gathered his children around their small fire to discuss the situation. "We could go to California like we planned," Rebecca said, though her voice lacked enthusiasm. "Or we could stay here," Grace added quietly. "I like it here." The twins exchanged glances. "The Apache boys said they'd teach us to make real bows," Johnny offered. Thomas looked at each of his children, seeing changes the weeks had wrought. They were darker from sun and weather, leaner from the active Apache lifestyle, more confident and self-reliant than they'd ever been. But more than that, they seemed truly content for the first time since Martha's death. "What about you, Becky?" he asked his eldest. "You're old enough to have a real say in this." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I miss Ma something terrible," she said finally. "But I think she'd want us to be where we could be happy, where we could be useful, and where people care about us. The soldiers won't just let us stay," Thomas pointed out. There'll be questions, reports to write. Some folks back east won't understand. Some folks back east never understood us anyway, Rebecca replied with surprising wisdom. We were always too poor, too rough around the edges for proper society. Thomas smiled at that. His daughter had inherited her mother's practical wisdom, along with her gentle heart. The next morning, Thomas walked out to meet the cavalry patrol. Lieutenant Morrison was a young man, perhaps 25, with the bearing of someone trying to live up to his uniform's authority. His relief at seeing Thomas alive was genuine. "Mr. Brennan, thank God you and your children survived. When we found the massacre site..." The lieutenant shook his head. "We've been searching for weeks. I'm grateful for your concern, Lieutenant. We have supplies, horses, everything you need to continue your journey to California. The Army will provide escort to ensure your safety." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's generous. Mind if I ask what brought you all the way out here? Apache territory isn't exactly a Sunday ride." Morrison's expression grew uncomfortable. "Well, there have been reports, stories about white captives being held by hostiles. Some folks were concerned about your situation." "My situation?" "Living among savages, sir. It's not natural. There are concerns about what might have happened to you, to your children, what you might have been forced to do or say." Thomas felt a flash of anger at the word savages, but he kept his voice level. "No one forced us to do anything, Lieutenant. The Apache saved our lives when they could have let us die." "Of course, sir, but you understand how it looks. A white family living with Indians. There are those who question whether such an arrangement might not be corrupting." The word hung in the air like a curse. Thomas thought of his children learning Apache stories, playing Apache games, speaking Apache words. Were they being corrupted, or were they simply learning to be human in a broader sense? "I need to think about this," Thomas said finally. Morrison looked surprised. "Think about what, sir? Surely you want to return to civilization." "This is civilization, Lieutenant. Just a different kind than you're used to." That afternoon, Thomas sought out Aiyana. He found her sitting by the stream that ran through the camp, watching the water flow over smooth stones. "The soldier wants us to leave," he said, settling beside her. "I know. If we stay, it'll bring trouble to your people. More soldiers will come, asking questions, making demands." Aiyana nodded. "This is true. But if we go..." Thomas struggled with the words. "If we go, we'll just be strangers again. Outsiders looking for a place that might not exist." They sat in silence for a while, watching a hawk circle overhead. Finally, Aiyana spoke. "When I was young, my grandmother told me a story about a seed that fell far from its parent tree. It could not grow in the hard ground where it landed, so a kind woman picked it up and planted it in her garden. The seed became a beautiful tree, but it was different from the others in that garden. Some people said it didn't belong. Others said it made the garden more beautiful because it was different." She looked at Thomas directly. "The question is not whether you belong here or there. The question is where you can grow, where your children can flourish, where you can give back as much as you receive." Thomas understood. It wasn't about race or culture or what other people thought. It was about finding home in the deepest sense, a place where love and respect could flourish despite differences. The decision, when it came, surprised everyone, including Thomas himself. "We'll go with you, Lieutenant," he told Morrison the next morning, "but not to California." "Sir, we're going back to Tucson. There's work to be done there." Morrison looked puzzled. "What kind of work?" Thomas glanced toward the Apache camp, where his children were saying difficult goodbyes to friends they'd made. "The kind that builds bridges instead of walls." The journey back to Tucson took 5 days. Along the way, Thomas explained his plan to his children. They would settle in the growing town, but not to hide from their experience among the Apache. Instead, they would use what they'd learned to help others understand that the Indian Wars didn't have to be a story of mutual destruction. "You mean, we're going to be like teachers?" Grace asked. "In a way. We're going to show people that Apache and white folks can live together, work together, maybe even learn from each other." Rebecca looked thoughtful. It won't be easy. Lots of people won't want to hear what we have to say. Your ma always said the hardest jobs were usually the most important ones, Thomas replied. In Tucson, they found a town buzzing with rumors about their survival and rescue. Some people viewed them as heroes. Others whispered that they'd been turned by their captors and couldn't be trusted. Thomas ignored both extremes and quietly set about establishing his new life. He opened a small general store, but not an ordinary one. Along with the usual supplies, he stocked Apache-made goods, baskets, pottery, blankets, that he purchased directly from Cochise's band and other peaceful groups. He employed Aiyana's nephew, a young man named Nalnish, who had learned some English and could serve as translator for Apache customers. The arrangement raised eyebrows and occasional complaints, but it also drew curious customers who had never seen authentic Indian crafts up close. Thomas made sure every purchase came with a story: who had made the item, what it was used for, what skills were required to create it. Rebecca proved especially gifted at this cultural bridging. Now 15 and mature beyond her years, she began teaching Apache language and customs to interested townspeople, while also helping Apache visitors navigate the complexities of white society. The first year in Tucson brought its share of difficulties. Some customers refused to shop at a store that dealt with Indians. Anonymous threats appeared under their door. Once, rocks were thrown through their windows. But for every person who opposed what they were doing, another seemed genuinely interested in learning. Mexican families in particular appreciated the cultural mixing. Many had Apache ancestors or had lived alongside various tribes for generations. Dr. Martinez, the town's only physician, became particularly interested in Apache medical knowledge. Through Thomas's connections, he was able to learn about desert plants and traditional remedies that proved remarkably effective for certain ailments. Father O'Brien, the Irish priest, who served Tucson's small Catholic community, saw theological parallels between Apache spiritual beliefs and Christian teachings. He began incorporating some Apache concepts of connection to nature into his sermons, to mixed but generally positive reactions. Most importantly, Thomas's work began to bear fruit in practical ways. When conflicts arose between Apache bands and white settlers, both sides increasingly turned to him as a mediator, someone who understood both cultures and could be trusted by both. The children thrived in their new roles as cultural ambassadors. The twins, now 11, served as informal guides for travelers passing through Apache territory, their knowledge of local customs and language helping prevent misunderstandings that might otherwise have led to violence. Grace, always drawn to stories, began collecting and writing down Apache legends and histories that might otherwise have been lost, as the traditional way of life came under increasing pressure. Baby Samuel, now a toddler, grew up bilingual and bicultural in a way that seemed as natural as breathing. He played equally happily with Apache and white children, switching between languages without thinking about it. 2 years after their rescue, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. Aiyana appeared at his store one morning just as he was opening, looking exactly as she had the day she'd found them in Devil's Canyon. "You have grown fat and soft, white man," she said with a slight smile. Thomas laughed, looking down at his slightly expanded waistline. "Prosperity agrees with me. You look well yourself." They talked for hours, catching up on news of the camp, the children's progress, the small successes and failures of Thomas's bridge-building efforts. Finally, Aiyana grew serious. "Cochise is dying," she said quietly. Thomas felt a stab of genuine grief. The war leader had become more than just the man who'd allowed them sanctuary. He'd become a friend, someone Thomas deeply respected. "I'm sorry. Is there anything?" "He wishes to see you, to see the children. He says he wants to understand what grows from the seeds he allowed to be planted." The journey to the Apache camp felt like a pilgrimage. Thomas closed his store temporarily, arranged for care of his business affairs, and loaded his family into a wagon for the trek into the mountains. They found Cochise much changed, thinner, weaker, but still possessing the sharp intelligence and quiet dignity that had impressed Thomas from their first meeting. "You have done well," the old war leader told Thomas as they sat beside his wickiup. The reports that reach us speak of peace where there was anger, understanding where there was fear. I had good teachers, Thomas replied. Cochise smiled. Perhaps. But teaching means nothing if the student will not learn. He looked toward where the children were playing with Apache youngsters, as if no time had passed since their last visit. They are strong, your little ones. They will do great things. What will happen to your people when you're gone? Thomas asked quietly. Cochise was silent for a long moment. Change comes whether we will it or not. The wise person learns to bend, with the wind rather than break against it. Your children, my children, they are the bending. They are how both our peoples survive. That night, there were stories and songs around the campfire. Thomas listened to Rebecca translating for her younger siblings, watched the twins demonstrate tracking skills they'd learned from Apache boys, smiled as Grace added her own embellishments to ancient legends. When morning came, Cochise called Thomas aside for a private conversation. I have a request, the old man said. When I die, my people will scatter. Some will go to the reservation, others will continue fighting until they too die. But there are some, the young ones, the ones who see that the old ways alone cannot survive. They will need guidance, Thomas. Waited, sensing the importance of what was coming. Aiyana will lead them. She has the wisdom and the respect of the people. But she will need allies in the white world, people who can speak for her when words matter more than weapons. You want me to help her. I want you to be the bridge you have already proven yourself to be. For both our people's children. Thomas looked across the camp to where Aiyana was teaching Rebecca how to make traditional medicine from desert plants. I'll do whatever I can. Cochise nodded slowly. Then both our peoples may yet have a future. In 1891, Thomas Brennan stood before a crowd in the Tucson Opera House, preparing to address the Territorial Convention on Indian Affairs. At 52, he had become one of Arizona's most respected voices on Apache-white relations. His hair was streaked with silver, his face weathered by decades of desert sun. But his eyes still held the determination that had sustained him through that terrible day in Devil's Canyon 20 years before. Behind him on the stage sat other speakers, government officials, military officers, businessmen. But in the front row of the audience, he could see faces that mattered more to him than any of those official voices. Rebecca, now 32 and married to Dr. Martinez's eldest son, had become a teacher who specialized in educating children from mixed Apache Mexican families. Her own children spoke 3 languages fluently and served as living examples of what cultural cooperation could achieve. The twins, Johnny and Jamie, had established a successful guide service that helped travelers navigate Apache territory safely. Their reputation for fairness and their connections in both communities had made them wealthy men by frontier standards. Grace had married Nalnish, Aiyana's nephew, in a ceremony that combined Apache and Christian traditions. She had written several books preserving Apache stories and had become something of a local celebrity as a result. Samuel, now 23, worked as an interpreter for the territorial government. His unique background and absolute fluency in Apache had made him invaluable in treaty negotiations. And in the third row, her hair now silver but her bearing, still proud, sat Aiyana. She had indeed led her people through the transition from free-roaming bands to reservation life, using her connections with Thomas and others to secure better treatment than many Apache groups received. She had never married, dedicating her life to her people's survival and adaptation. Thomas began his speech with words that had become his trademark opening. 20 years ago, my family and I learned that civilization is not a place or a people. It is a choice. The choice to extend mercy when revenge would be easier. The choice to build bridges when walls would be safer. The choice to see the humanity in those who are different from us. He went on to outline his proposals for Apache education programs, for economic development projects that would benefit both communities, for legal protections that would preserve Apache rights, while encouraging integration into territorial society. But as he spoke, his mind drifted back to that morning in Devil's Canyon when an Apache woman had looked at 6 strangers and chosen mercy over justice, hope over hatred. That choice had rippled outward through the years, touching hundreds of lives, changing the course of history in ways both small and large. It had proven that even in the darkest times, even when cultures clashed and blood was spilled, individuals could still choose to write a different story. When the applause finally died down, Thomas left the stage and walked directly to Aiyana. They embraced briefly, an old friendship that had weathered decades of change. "Your daughter would be proud," he said quietly. Aiyana smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "As would your Martha. They watch over us still, I think. They see what grew from the seeds of their sacrifice." Outside the opera house, the Brennan and Apache families gathered for a meal at the hotel restaurant, a sight that would have been unthinkable 20 years earlier, but now seemed perfectly natural to most of Tucson's residents. As they ate and talked and laughed together, Thomas reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them all to this moment. A wagon train massacre had become the beginning of understanding. A chance encounter with an enemy had become a lifelong friendship. The worst day of his life had somehow led to his life's greatest purpose. He thought of Cochise's words about bending with the wind rather than breaking against it. Both peoples had bent, both had adapted, both had found ways to preserve what mattered most while embracing necessary change. The work wasn't finished, would never be finished, really. There would always be those on both sides who preferred the old hatreds to new possibilities. But looking around the table at the mixed gathering of faces, at children who moved seamlessly between worlds, at friendships that transcended race and culture, Thomas knew that something beautiful had been built from tragedy. Later that evening, as the families prepared to return to their various homes, Aiyana pulled Thomas aside one last time. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had simply kept walking that morning?" she asked. "If I had left you to die in the desert as so many of my people would have done?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I think about it sometimes, but then I remind myself that you didn't keep walking. You chose differently. And that choice changed everything." Aiyana nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to say that we are all given moments when we can choose to be the person we want to be, or the person our pain tells us to be. That morning in Devil's Canyon was my moment." "And you chose to be Eternal Blossom," Thomas said, using the English translation of her name. "You chose to bloom even in the harshest season." As they parted ways that night, Thomas felt a deep sense of completion. The story that had begun with gunshots and death had become something else entirely, a testament to the power of individual choice to overcome historical hatred, a proof that mercy could indeed triumph over vengeance when people had the courage to take the first difficult step. Behind them, the lights of Tucson glowed against the desert stars, illuminating a community that had learned to honor both its Apache and its European heritage. Ahead lay new challenges, new opportunities to choose hope over fear, understanding over ignorance. The story was ending, but it was also just beginning. And in that paradox lay the true lesson of that long-ago morning when an Apache woman saved a widower and his 5 children, forever changing the definition of what it meant to be saved.